So let's talk about this story that America is completely obsessed with right now. This is the biggest story in America, and I'm pretty sure all of you guys have seen that video of Mr. Floyd. He is on his belly, his hands are behind his back, they are strapped together with handcuffs, and Officer Chauvin has his neck pressed against his neck, and he is saying, I can't breathe, and then he becomes unresponsive, and then an hour or so later, he is declared dead. And this story is causing a lot of tension, and it's really just amplifying tension that has been here for a long time. And there is a lot of very, very dangerous things in the political atmosphere of the United States, and it goes in tandem with what has been taking place in the Western world in general, with the rise of very, very radical ideologies, both in the left wing and the right wing. And so we're seeing really a resurgence of the far left. We're seeing a resurgence in fascism. People are using this story to promote fascism, and at the same time, they're using this story to promote radical left-wing ideology, anarchism, and just really hatred for the police. So this is a very, very tense situation, but it's being capitalized upon by some very, very dark political elements. Like I said, I'm pretty sure all of you guys have seen the video, and people for the most part come to either two conclusions when they see the video. They say, this is really horrendous, this cop murdered this man, or they say, it looks like the cop did what he had to do to take this guy down and to control him, because there was obviously a call to the police for help. This guy was doing something that made someone suspicious. The cop came, or the police came, and they needed to take this guy down. And so the knee on the neck is, standard procedure. This is going to be one of the main arguments used to defend Officer Chauvin. Now, what took place? What led up to what we've seen in the video? The New York Times, according to the conservatives, the New York Times is fake news. But nonetheless, the New York Times put out a pretty detailed article about what took place what took place before this whole thing occurred. So Mr. Floyd went inside of the store. He wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes. He gave the employee a $20 bill. The employee determined that the $20 bill was fake. In fact, he said that the $20 bill was so obviously fake that you could see the ink seeping out of it. So the employee exits the store. He sees Mr. Floyd, who at that point is inside of his vehicle. He approaches Mr. Floyd. He says, hey, this $20 bill is fake. Please return the pack of cigarettes. Mr. Floyd does not want to comply. The employee eventually calls 911, and he says, this guy gave me a fake $20 bill. He refuses to give me the pack of cigarettes. Okay, so the cops eventually come, and they tell Mr. Floyd to exit his vehicle. He doesn't comply. They force him out, and they take him to the ground, and then you know what took place, right? Chauvin presses his knee against Mr. Floyd's neck, and Mr. Floyd says, I can't breathe. An hour or so later, he's declared dead. Now, you have different sides to this story, different sides regarding this story. You have one side that says that Officer Chauvin is a murderer. He should be charged with first-degree murder. He should be declared a murderer, and you have that narrative. And this is really the left-wing narrative, generally speaking. And then you have the moderate position, which is allow the court to decide, allow the trial to come to the conclusion about what took place, allow the story to flesh itself out, allow the story to unfold. And then you have the other side that wants to use this story as a way to foment hatred between blacks and whites. And they have some weird fantasy about starting a race war, or they want to use the story as a step towards eventually causing a full-out war against the state and establishing some sort of a fascist or jingoistic totalitarian regime. Now, you have two radical sides, two radical elements in this whole situation. You have the far left element, and then you have the far right element. The far right element, they want to use the story to foment war against the left, and a lot of them want to start a race war. This is what the whole Boogaloo thing is about. Boogaloo is Boogoloo, I think. But if you look up this term, there are a lot of articles about it. And you have actually had protesters who have taken pictures of themselves, you know, with masks and all that, or you know, they take pictures of what's taking place in the protests, and they'll put the story up and they'll say hashtag Boogaloo. In fact, the government in Minnesota has actually addressed this issue. The governor of Minnesota said that, in fact, you have radical elements that are really just provocateurs who are using the situation to spark violence. They did things to spark the massive amounts of property destruction that took place. In fact, the Minnesota State Commissioner, John Harrington, he said that a number of the people who caused a lot of the destruction were tied to white supremacy groups. So it's not just the far left who are involved, you also have the far right. The far left, they want to use this situation as a way to promote anarchism. They want to say, look, the cops are evil, police officers are thugs, or they say all cops are bastards. ACAB, that's an actual acronym that's used, ACAB. It stands for all cops are bastards. It's a pretty insidious thing to say. It's a very insidious group that's promoting this because they want to cause vicious revolution. And so they talk about how evil the police are, but if they ever got their way, they would establish something quite horrendously tyrannical and despotic and murderous, and there's no doubt in my mind about that. So here's the thing, and here's what makes this situation so dangerous. What makes the situation dangerous is when you watch the video at the surface, and let's say you already have a bias against the police, or let's say you lean liberal, or let's say you really don't fully understand the situation and you feel some sort of compassion. You watch the video and you think, oh, this person was murdered. In fact, when I first saw the video, that's what I thought. And I don't lean left, but when I saw the video, I honestly immediately, because I was reacting with emotion, but I immediately got the impression that this is murder. But then you have new information that comes into the news, and with that new information, you get a better understanding of what has taken place. The problem is that you have a huge amount of the American population who saw the video, and that's it. Their minds have already been made up, and they can't change their mind. They're so stuck in this narrative that even when new information comes out, they still believe that Officer Chauvin is a murderer and that Mr. Floyd was murdered. There was an autopsy that was done, concluding that there is no sign of asphyxiation on the body. Officer Chauvin did not asphyxiate Mr. Floyd to death. It just didn't happen. That's what the autopsy concluded. Now, the family of Floyd wants to do an independent autopsy, but I don't really know if that's going to help their case, because if the person was truly asphyxiated, the autopsy would have found that out. But in the whole quagmire of the anger and the tension and the chaos and the protesting, once this new information comes out, what happens is that you have the right wing that responds against the left wing reaction. So you have the left wing reaction to this story, which is filled with anarchism and just plain hatred to the cops. And the problem with a dramatic left wing or a highly emotional left wing reaction is that as a response, you have the highly emotional and violent reaction by the right to the left. So the left is up here, filled with anger and rage. The right wing sees what's happening, and the right wingers are a lot more. I think right wingers are a lot more calculated than left wingers. That's just from my own observation. One thing I've noticed is that left wingers, they respond more with emotion. At least on the surface, they're more emotional. Right-wingers, they do have emotions, they do react with emotion, but to reference Hilaire Belloc, they don't allow the emotions to fully direct their actions. Right-wingers, I notice, are very calculative, and they wait for the right opportunities to strike, and they also wait for facts to manifest themselves, or to facts, they wait for certain facts to be revealed, and then they use those facts as weapons against the left. And this is what's going to be happening. In fact, this is already happening in this whole George Floyd situation, because for a while, the liberals, the leftists were saying, oh, this guy was murdered. And then it was found out through the autopsy that he was not asphyxiated. The cop did not asphyxiate this guy. The right takes that story and says, look, you guys are wrong. And in that regard, the right is correct. The asphyxiation didn't happen. What eventually is going to be the argument, or this is probably already the argument, but what's going to be the argument of the people who want to see Chauvin be put in prison, is that Chauvin triggered an already existing heart condition that Floyd had. But then the argument against Officer Chauvin is going to be, wait a second, Mr. Floyd said, I have difficulty breathing when he was in the vehicle. In fact, the Hennepin County attorney made a complaint against Chauvin specifying this, saying that Mr. Floyd told the officer, I can't breathe, I'm claustrophobic, before they took him to the ground. So Mr. Chauvin knew already that he had difficulty breathing at that point. He kept his knee on his neck. And there's already a complaint that was made saying that for almost 3 minutes, in that situation where Chauvin's knee was pressed against Floyd's neck, he had his knee on his neck for a total of around 8 minutes, but almost 3 minutes of that duration, in almost 3 minutes of that duration, Mr. Floyd was unresponsive. He was passed out. And Mr. Chauvin still kept his knee pressed against his neck. The argument against Chauvin is going to be the threat was gone. The threat was neutralized. There was no danger coming from this man. He was unresponsive for almost 3 minutes. Why did you proceed to keep your knee on his neck? And that's what's going to be used against him, ultimately. There's no way that they're going to get first-degree murder on this guy. That's why Keith Ellison said third degree. That's why they charged him with third-degree murder, because they know they can't get first degree. Nonetheless, the narrative is still there. The narrative that this was murder is still there, pumping through the veins of the left. The scary thing is the right-wing response to the outrage of the left. And when it turns out that, hey, Mr. Chauvin did not do first-degree murder, he put his knee on this guy's neck, but it was to control him because he wasn't complying. In fact, there was a video that just came out recently showing that Mr. Floyd was resisting arrest. So the right wing is going to say, hey, he was resisting arrest. They had to control him. The knee on the neck, that's a very, very commonly used strategy. It's allowed in the state of Minnesota. Mr. Chauvin had to control this person. Yes, he had a heart condition, but nonetheless, he had to control the situation. He had to do what he had to do as an officer. That is going to be the argument in defense of Officer Chauvin. But outside of that, revolving around that, you have two narratives, the left-wing narrative and the right-wing narrative, that are both filled with outrage. And they are both using the situation for their own insidious ends. One for anarchism, the other for racism. Because look what happened. You had these riots, you had massive amounts of property destruction, and the state of Minnesota said, hey, they were outside provocateurs in this whole situation. Hey, there were right-wing elements in these riots. So what you're seeing is tension coming from both sides, the left and the right. And that's what makes this whole thing so dangerous, because the videos that you're seeing in the news, they're showing what? They're showing rioters destroying property, and a lot of these rioters are African American. The right is then going to say, look at these inferior, primitive people, these low IQ people, and look at these evil, evil anarchist leftists. Look how much destruction they cause. And they're going to be using this footage as a way to bolster up their own position and to better their own image as the solution to this left-wing problem. And then on top of that, you have Donald Trump saying that this was Antifa and it was the liberal left. And so when the president says that, the right wing just sucks that up, and that further boosts up their position and that further empowers them. What makes the situation dangerous also, because we've had situations like this before. We had Rodney King. We had numerous things like this that have happened in the past. What we're seeing now isn't really unusual, but what makes it different and what makes it more insidious is the fact that we are living in the context of Bannonism. We have the Steve Bannon mentalities, the Breitbart mentalities, the alt-right mentality. This I don't want to say it's new, but this reemergence of ultranationalism is very real and it's very popular. And so when you throw that into the mix, that causes an even more vicious reaction against the left by the right. And what you have at the end of the day are three words: strategy of tension. Strategia della tensione. This is not a term that I made up. This is a term that comes from Italy, and it stems from the Gladio operations that were being backed by NATO, essentially to cause tension between the left and the right, as a way to eventually bolster the position of right-wing nationalism in Europe. And so we know for a fact that Western governments have a huge interest in promoting racialism and nationalism. This goes back to Gladio, it goes back to the Cold War. And so if I had to give you my my hunch as to what is taking place, I think that there is really a strategy of tension that is being conducted. And that's why you have the president saying, oh, it's the evil left, it's Antifa. And recently, Donald Trump, just actually today, there are reports coming out saying that Donald Trump wants to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. So this is further throwing fuel into the fire in the strategy of tension in which you have the right and the left wanting to go to war with each other. And so in the phenomena of this intensification of left-wing fanaticism and right-wing fanaticism, eventually something is going to implode, and I think ultimately there's going to be a repeat of what took place in the first half of the 20th century. And I think what we're seeing now is simply a presaging sign of that. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.